All right. So here's the different layers that we have. At the top up here, this is the surface of your skin. So there's your surface. Okay. The very top layer is made up of a layer that's called the stratum corneum. So stratum means layer. So each of the layers of the epidermis are going to start with stratum, because that just means layer, right? And then underneath that, we have a layer that's called the stratum lucidum. Underneath that, we have a layer called the stratum granulosum, then the stratum spinosum, then the stratum basal. I always like to say basal, but I think it's basal, so, because you think of basal carcinoma. Okay. All right, so how do we remember these? We have to come up with a mnemonic. I always think those are good. So we're going to look at the second word and the first letter of the second word. Okay. So for stratum corneum, we have C. So what we can say is, come, let's get sunburned. Come, let's get sunburned, right? And that'll help you remember the different layers. So just remember that the corneum is the most superficial. And then you have the dermis at the bottom. And then underneath the dermis, you have the basement membrane. I'm sorry, no you don't. Sorry about that. You have the, here's the dermis. So underneath the epidermis, you have the dermis. In here, this is all dermis down here. And it's underneath the dermis that you have the basement membrane. Okay? All right, so we're going to talk about the dermis in a minute, but what we're most interested right now is in the epidermis. So we have to go through each one of these layers, and we have to talk about what happens in each one of these layers. So we start out with it's all stratified squamous. And the cells, they start out in this very bottom layer that's called the stratum basal, or basal, right? So in this stratum basal layer, we have stem cells. And those stem cells are constantly going through mitosis because, you know, the surface of your skin, it's constantly being sloughed off. So we have to create new cells. So the stratum basal layer has these cells in there that will go through mitosis, and one daughter cell goes up to the next layer and the other daughter cell stays in the stratum basal. That's what happens at the end of mitosis. One moves up and the other one stays in the stratum basal layer. Now these cells, they are stratified squamous, but we give them a different name because they're in the skin. That way we don't have to keep saying the stratified squamous cells of the epidermis. So we call these cells in here, they're going to be called keratinocytes. That's the name we're going to give them all the way through. So the keratinocytes, the stem cells create a keratinocyte, and every time the stem cells create a keratinocyte, the next one keeps moving up and up and up. It's just going to keep moving up to the surface until it's time to get sloughed off, right? So we have to go through the changes. We have to talk about what are the changes that that cell is going to go through as it goes up. So the first change that's going to happen, you know, it's a daughter cell up here. It's a daughter cell in that stratum spinosum layer because it was in the stratum basal layer. It got pushed up into the stratum spinosum layer at the end of mitosis. So stratum spinosum. Spinosum sounds like a spine. So where did we hear spiny when we were talking about cells? Do you remember the description? Right, so we were talking about that when a cell loses water, it gets spiny. So that's what happens in the stratum spinosum layer. This cell is going to start to lose water and it's going to get real spiny. Okay? Remember, there's no blood vessels coming in here, so there's really no good way for those cells to get fluid, because that's where a cell would get fluid, is by blood vessels that are bringing the fluid to the area. So they don't get really good blood fluid, so they start to shrink. They shrink and get spiny. That's what happens in the stratum spinosum layer. The next layer then is called the stratum granulosum. And so granulosum kind of sounds like granular or grainy, right? So now when it gets, the keratinocytes get pushed up into this stratum granulosum layer, they start to produce a bunch of proteins, okay? And that protein is called keratin. And keratin looks in the cell, it starts to make it look really grainy. So those spiny cells now look real grainy. There's lots of dots in them, and they just look like they're getting really granular, right? Really grainy. So that, again, that happens in the stratum granulosum layer. In this layer, okay? Keratin is produced. Keratin is a protein. Now that protein has a little bit of a waterproofing characteristic to it, right? So it's starting to help waterproof the skin. Now the next layer is called the stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin. You guys have any idea where your thick skin would be? Yeah, there you go. So you're right, but bottom of the feet, yep, palms of the hands, those are the thick skin. So that just adds an extra layer of cells. There's an extra layer of cells in that stratum lucidum layer. Not that much different than what we have, you know, in the stratum granulosum layer. So it's just an extra layer. So normally, in all the skin in your body, you have 4 layers, but in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, you have 5. Okay? So then that cell will move up, the keratinocyte will move up into the stratum corneum layer. And now at this point, this cell is dying. And by the time it gets to the surface, it is dead. Okay? It's really not getting, there's no blood supply, it's not getting nutrients, it's not getting water, it dies. And then eventually it sloughs off. Or in other words, it sheds. In your notes from the bookstore, you'll see that the stratum basal layer can also be called the stratum germinativum layer. It's easier on the lab exam to say stratum basal. So we've got some, chapter 5 has some skin models. You'll be able to see those on Wednesday. We'll look at those on Wednesday. Okay, now some other considerations are, we want to talk about perspiration, and actually I'm going to leave perspiration until we get to the other accessory structures of the dermis. But I should say, it takes about anywhere from 15 days to a month in order for that cell to move from the basal layer all the way up. It takes anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. For those cells to move on up. Okay, a blister. A blister will be if you break some of the cells in the epidermis, and they form kind of a pocket of water in the epidermis, or if you form a pocket of water in between the epidermis and the dermis. That's what blisters are. Okay. Okay, so now let's take a look at this lowest level, this stratum basal level. There's a couple of other things I want to talk to you about that happen right in that layer. So we're going to look at that. Okay, so when we look at this, you know, again, it's these two layers here, the epidermis and the dermis, and then everything that's inside here. We're going to see sweat glands, we're going to see hair follicles, we're going to see some smooth muscle, we're going to see some sebaceous glands. So there's a lot of things in here that we're going to look at in the cutaneous membrane. Several layers that we're going to look at in the cutaneous membrane and several accessory structures. So the integumentary system is the cutaneous membrane plus the accessory structures. Now when we look down here at the bottom and you see all those fat cells, that's not really included in the cutaneous membrane, okay? That is called the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer, and we're going to talk about that. It's not part of the cutaneous membrane though. Okay. So what do you think the skin does? You know, first of all, it adds protection. Okay, it's protecting the rest of your body from contusions and abrasions and shocks and chemicals and all of those things. It also helps to maintain your temperature, your body temperature. This layer of fat down here adds an extra layer of insulation. We're going to see how the top layer here, which is called the epidermis, how that is able to store nutrients. And there's also some nerve endings that we're going to see that go up to that epidermis. And we're going to look at that, and we're going to see how that, you know, helps to alert you that something is near your skin. And then it also helps to excrete and secrete things, meaning your sweat helps you to get rid of water and salts and other organic wastes. So let's take a look at the top layer here. This top layer right here is called the epidermis. So it's just all right, this thinner layer. You know, it's not very thick at all. It's probably about as thin as cellophane paper, you know, cellophane. So that's not very thick. That's about as thick as it is. And if you remember, well, what this epidermis is made of is stratified squamous. So stratified squamous is what type of tissue? It's epithelium, right? And one of the things we said about epithelium is that it does not receive blood supply, right? There's no blood vessels going into that epidermis. There's blood vessels below the epidermis. We can see a blood vessel here and here. These are arteries and veins, little arteries and veins. We can see those. They're below it.
So the epidermis is avascular?
The epidermis is avascular, yes. The layer right below that is called the dermis, and the dermis has blood vessels in it. And it's those things that make up that cutaneous membrane. It's the epidermis and the dermis that make up the cutaneous membrane. Okay? So we're going to focus on the epidermis. That's the top layer of your skin. And the dermis isn't that thick either. The dermis underneath it is probably about as thick as a, you know, like a baggie, a sandwich baggie, a thicker, like freezer baggie. That's about as thick as the dermis is. So the epidermis is super thin, the dermis is a little bit thicker. So let's look at the epidermis. Here, we said that in the epidermis there's no blood vessels, right? But in the dermis below it, there are blood vessels. So in a person that's very fair-skinned, you can see that blood vessel, you can see the blood through the skin. That epidermis is kind of translucent. And so a person will have like a pinkish color, right? They'll have a pinkish color. If they, if the blood vessels dilate, like if they've been exercising or if they're embarrassed or something like that, the blood vessels dilate, more blood comes to the area, and then they look real flushed, right? And they blush. If a person is deprived of oxygen, then their blood is going to be more, it's going to have less oxygen in it, and blood that has less oxygen appears like a darker blue color, and we call that cyanosis. So you'll be able to see that, you'll be able to see cyanosis, not so much on a darker skinned person, but on a lighter skinned person, you can see cyanosis, and it's a good clue that they are lacking oxygen, especially around the lips and on the fingertips. Okay, you'll be able to see cyanosis. Another thing that causes variation of skin color is a pigment that's called carotene. So that is carotene. Carotene. It's different, it's spelled different than keratin. So keratinocytes, that's the name of the cell. Keratin is the protein that the cells produce. But carotene, that is a pigment. It's an orange pigment. Right? So we normally don't find this in the skin, but it's found in like orange vegetables. Right? So if like squash, carrots, things like that. And it accumulates in the epidermis. It'll accumulate in here, in the cells of the epidermis. And so a person that would eat a lot of these vegetables will actually have an orangish glow to them, an orangish appearance. A few semesters ago, I had a student that she lived on squash, and she quite literally had orange palms of her hands. Her whole appearance appeared orangish, but the palms of her hands were orange because this pigment accumulates right in those cells. So babies, a lot of times they're given a lot of baby food with these vegetables in it. They'll too have kind of like an orangey-ish appearance. Okay, so you'll want to know those different things that cause variations in skin color. So it was dermal circulation we talked about. The blood gives a reddish tint to light-skinned people. Cyanosis is bluish if you don't have proper amount of oxygen in the blood. We talked about the melanocytes. And then we talked about the carotene. Okay? Y'all good with that? Okay. Now let's look at the dermis. But here's a picture before I move on. Don't want to forget this. So the epidermis has a steroid in it. Those cells have a steroid in it. And the sun that you're getting, the rays from the sun, they give off a vitamin D. It's actually vitamin D3. And that vitamin D3 will cause, well, I don't want to go too far into depth in this. the sun causes your skin to, all right, vitamin D3. All right, let's do this again. The sun causes a steroid in your skin to convert to vitamin D3. Now, I don't want to get too far in with this, but vitamin D3 then will cause your liver and kidney to work together to produce a hormone called calcitriol. And I'm not going to go through the steps and how that happens now. We'll do that in advanced. But this vitamin D3 will cause calcitriol to be released. We're going to talk about calcitriol in chapter 6 anyway. You need this calcitriol to absorb calcium. So what's the bottom line? You need the sun to create vitamin D3 to absorb calcium. And you guys knew that, right? Do any of you take supplements? You take calcium supplements? Calcium supplements always come along with vitamin D. They go hand in hand. You have to have vitamin D in order for calcium to be absorbed in your gut, right? So anyway, we need the sun to get the vitamin D3, to get the calcitriol, to absorb the calcium. In a person that doesn't have that, I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff here. We're going to see this on this, what I'm going to talk about is on your lab model. So I just want to make sure that you guys can see where it is now. So when you look at the lab model, you'll be able to see it better. Okay, so this is the hair right here, right? And we see this smooth muscle right there. That is called the erector pili, and this is on your lab list. Erector pili, the erector pili muscle. 2 R's. Erector pili muscle. It's smooth muscle. And so it is going to contract when a person is cold or anxious. And when it contracts, it makes the hair stand straight up on end, kind of gives you a goosebumps and makes the hair stand up. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's all I'm going to talk about with the hair. There's also sebaceous glands, and here I'm going to show you on this picture again. So here we can see attached to that hair follicle, there's this gland right here. Right? And it's got epithelial tissue surrounding it. That gland is called a sebaceous gland. And the sebaceous gland releases an oil. And the oil we call sebum. So the oil, you know, you shampoo your hair and you get rid of all of that sebum. And then you wait a while and the sebaceous gland starts producing this oil. And if you don't wash your hair in a few days, then you start to feel like your scalp is oily. That's coming from those sebaceous glands. Okay? Then the last accessory structure that we want to talk about is called so again, the epidermis is the top layer here. Right there, so you can see the epidermis, it's right here, and then you can see the dermis below it, which is right here, right? And these cells, if you look at these cells, they even kind of look like they're stratified, so you know they're multiple layers. And then the layers that are closest to the surface they're kind of flat and squatty, so that's squamous. So those are stratified squamous cells. And what we said about epithelium is that when it comes in contact to the tissue below it, there is a basement membrane underneath the bottom cells. So we're going to have the epidermal cells, and then we're going to have the basement membrane, and then we have the dermis below it. Now, the basement membrane and the cells at the bottom of the epidermis, they're not going to be flat, because that would mean that the two layers, if the two layers had flat edges, they would come together like this, and that would make it very easy to separate. So instead, we've got these ridges in the epidermis, and we've got these papillae that poke upwards in the dermis, and they come together more like a puzzle piece. Makes it much harder for them to separate, so they stay closer together, right? Well, what that also does is it creates so again, that is formed by that epidermal ridge and the dermal papillae. How they come together, that's how your fingerprints are formed. So now let's take a look at all the different layers that are found in this epidermis, in the top layer, the most superficial layer. So here's kind of a picture showing the different layers, and this is a microscopic type of picture that we're seeing, and this is the basement membrane down on the bottom here. So I'm going to kind of go to a drawn picture. I think it's going to be easier to look at. Fingerprints. All of those epidermal ridges and the dermal papillae, when they come together like that, they form your fingerprints, right? And no two people have the same fingerprints, right? Here we can see, this is actually the stratum basal layer. And you can see all of these cells in here, these normal looking cells. Those normal looking cells are the keratinocytes. You can see that they have a nucleus. And then you see this big cell right here called the melanocyte. And the melanocyte is a normal cell. And it has these big extensions coming off of it. You can see that it reaches up into the basal layer, and it can even reach up into that next layer, the spinosum layer. Okay, so it can go from the basal layer, and it can extend up into that spinosum layer. And so what this cell does is it produces a brown pigment. This cell is called the melanocyte, and it produces a brown pigment called melanin. Melanin is very protective. And so when that brown pigment is released, the cell will kind of pinch off a vesicle and release a vesicle into the keratinocyte, and then it'll release the melanin into the cell. So the melanin, what it does is it surrounds the nucleus, right? It surrounds the nucleus. And when it surrounds the nucleus, it doesn't allow the UV radiation from the sun to penetrate the nucleus. All right? So the melanin gives the skin a brown color. And people have varying shades of this melanin. A person that has very little production, when the melanocyte is not producing it fast enough, they're going to have real fair skin, right? Very fair skin. If the melanocyte is producing the melanin at a faster rate, a person will have darker skin, right? The more melanin there is, the more protected the DNA is. The less melanin, the more susceptible that nucleus is to UV radiation. So we know that people that have really fair skin, they're very susceptible to skin cancer. You've heard of basal carcinoma. The UV radiation can actually get into their nucleus of their cells and make the nucleus start acting improperly, producing abnormal proteins, which we call cancer. Right? When a person that has fair skin is, or not as fair, when they're exposed to the sunlight, to the UV radiation, that'll trigger the melanocytes to start producing more melanin to try to protect their DNA. Let's see. There are some other considerations when we're talking about skin color. If we look back at this, so this is two different types of cancer. This is a basal cell carcinoma. So this is starting in that stratum basal layer, or in the stratum spinosum right above it. Usually in a person that has thin skin or light-skinned, nothing to protect their DNA. The DNA start producing abnormal proteins, and it looks like this. It has kind of a uniform edge on it. It's probably much bigger underneath the skin. Probably looks more like like an iceberg underneath the skin. None of the color bleeds out. It's not bleeding out. So when we look at it, we say, well, it looks real uniform. It's kind of the same color as the rest of the skin. It's not bleeding out. The pigment isn't bleeding out. And so that's what we would call benign, that it's not going to metastasize or go to anywhere else in the body. This cell here, this is melanoma. So a melanoma is much more dangerous. If we look at the edges, you can see that it's not real uniform. We can see it bleeding out here along the edges. We see it bleeding out even more over here. It's much more shiny than the rest of the skin. So it's a dangerous one. This is the one that's going to metastasize and could go to the liver or another important organ. So you want to make sure that you're checking your skin frequently, looking for anything that might look abnormal.
What's that one called again?
That is melanoma. That's right, melanoma. There's one other thing, too, I have to talk about with the epidermoid. Whoops, let me go back. We might see this disorder. This disorder is called Rickets. What calcium does, what does calcium do for your bone? It makes it hard and strong, right? So if you're not absorbing calcium because you have a vitamin D deficiency, your bones are soft. And when bones are soft, as a person grows and they're putting all that weight on those bones, they're going to end up with curved legs like this, curved bones. That's called rickets. Okay, rickets. Rickets is due to a lack or deficiency of vitamin D. Right? It's a lack of vitamin D, and it causes the bones to bow. Right? Now we're going to look at the dermis. Mapping of all of those fibers, they map out like this on the body. You can see a distinct mapping of all of these fibers. So there's a lot of collagen fibers. Collagen were the ones that were bendy. There's a lot of these fibers, and they're all mapped out in the body. And we call those layers, whoops, shoot. Look at this. The lines of cleavage. So we can see all of these different, I just wanted to check and make sure that they didn't change the name on me again. You can see how they're all kind of mapped out in a certain direction like that. Down here on the buttocks, they're going this way. On the thigh, they're going this way, and then this way. On the front, they're going this way, right? So those are the lines of cleavage. And it's just the way the collagen fibers are running. Which direction are they running? So what we know is that if this person got a cut that went in the same direction as the lines of cleavage, so you had collagen fibers like this, you got a cut, they split apart, it's going to heal nice, right? But if they got a cut that was perpendicular to those lines of cleavage, now you're taking one collagen fiber and you're disconnecting it, it's not going to heal. It's not going to heal very well. Sometimes the sores won't close up at all. So surgeons take this into account, and they make sure that they're trying to, go along the lines of cleavage as much as possible so that the incision will heal a lot better, right? We know that women used to get, C-sections, and of course their C-sections would be down the abdominal area, and then it just didn't heal that well. So now the C-sections are just a tiny, it's going to be a tiny little incision more along the lines of cleavage, so that it'll heal better, right? So that's the thing with the lines of cleavage. And again, that's from the collagen in the dermis. There are some accessory structures in the dermis that we're going to want to talk about. So everything we did, we were talking about the epidermis up here. We talked about the different layers. We talked about the skin color. We talked about vitamin D3. All of that goes on in the epidermis. Now we're going to look at the dermis, which is right below this. Yeah, and we also talked about fingerprints. Okay, so in the dermis, right below it, there's two different layers. There's a top papillary layer, and there's a bottom reticular layer. Okay, there's a papillary and a reticular layer. So the top layer is made out of areolar tissue, and the bottom layer we have dense, irregular connective tissue. So do you remember when we were talking about those membranes, we said a membrane is a layer of epithelium and a layer of connective tissue, right? So that's cutaneous membrane is the epidermis, which is epithelial tissue, and the dermis, which is connective tissue. That's why we call it a membrane, because it has both epithelial and connective tissue. Okay? So in the dense irregular connective tissue, do you remember what the purpose of that was? It's what?
Loose tissue.
It is, it's dense. So there was loose and dense, and this is a dense one. But if you remember all of the fibers in there, they kind of go in different directions.
Also, you give it stretch.
Yeah, so you can stretch, exactly. So you can stretch the skin in many different directions. That's exactly right. So this, the dermis is really giving the skin its strength, and so you can stretch it in many different directions. These fibers, though, the way they're oriented, there's a lot of them going in the same direction. When we look at, there's a lot of blood vessels. We have all these blood vessels in here. There's lots of blood vessels. If you get a cut into this layer, you're bleeding, right? You're going to have blood. All right, I think that's all right now that I want to talk about the dermis. I am going to show you, like I said, the accessory structures, but I'm going to show that in just. The only one that doesn't have the blood vessels, the epidermis does not have blood vessels. But the dermis, both layers have blood vessels. Both layers have blood vessels. You cut that through the epidermis and you're going to bleed. Okay, there's also nerve endings in this in the dermis. So if you cut the area, it's going to be painful. Okay. So there's blood, there's nerves, there's collagen fibers creating the lines of cleavage, all of that. Then the bottommost layer here is called the subcutaneous layer. So underneath the dermis, we have the subcutaneous or the hypodermis layer. So have you heard of a subcutaneous injection? Or a hypodermic needle? Right? So those are intended to be injected. That medicine is intended to be injected down here in the subcutaneous or hypodermis layer. Okay, again, it's not part of the cutaneous membrane, but it's an important part of the integument. It's underneath. It's filled with these fat cells that we call adipocytes, which provide insulation as well as nutrients. What nutrients do they store? Triglycerides. Yep, triglycerides. There's also bigger blood vessels down here in the hypodermis layer. Okay, big blood vessels. So this is where your skin really is going to hold most of the blood, is in the hypodermis layer. And so since there's so many blood vessels in that layer, we say that this is a blood reservoir for your body. Your body can store blood in the hypodermis layer. It stores blood. And when a person is going into shock or when they're going to faint, those blood vessels constrict, and all that blood goes to other areas like the brain and the heart, and so a person will look extremely pale. They don't have any of those, they don't have enough blood going to the area. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. You guys are supposed to tell me when I've gone for 40 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Keep forgetting. I forgot too. Okay, so let's talk now about some of the hair follicles, sweat glands, the blood vessels, nerve endings. I'm going to talk more about those at the end of this chapter, but yeah, I don't really see a lot. We talk about hair a little bit, and then we talk about glands. So where do I want to put that in here? Let me just talk again. Let's look at wrinkles in here. So those collagen fibers, as a person ages, the collagen fibers in there kind of, they degrade a little bit, and so there's not as much elasticity in there. So when the skin gets stretched, it doesn't normally go back. It won't go back to its normal condition as a person ages. So then they end up with wrinkles, right? So that's what kind of causes wrinkles. Hormones can do that as well. When a woman gets pregnant and the hormones are, not allowing the skin to go back to its normal position, she might end up with wrinkles, or stretch marks, I should say, rather than wrinkles, when the elastic limits have sort of been bypassed, exceeded. But there is something that you guys should know about for the health field, and that's what's called skin turgor. Okay? Turgor is Turgor. And this is, skin turgor is caused by the fluid that's in the skin, right? So the cells should have some fluid in there. And this, in the dermis especially, so the dermis does have a blood supply in here. So the cells in the dermis should have plenty of fluid. They shouldn't be dying off, right? And so when you have enough fluid, the skin has a good, what we call skin turgor. So when, like if you're checking your hand and you pinch the skin, it should just go back to its normal position, right? But if you pinch the skin and there's not enough fluid in there and you let go, the skin will stay up. like it was when you pinched it. And that would mean that a person has poor skin turgor. So we actually use that term. The skin can't maintain its flexibility without that fluid, so then it just stays up like that. Dehydration reduces it. We would think that a person is dehydrated if we see that. Elderly are going to be more susceptible to dehydration anyway. Their skin might stay up anyway, but if it stays up, if it really stays up when you pinch it, then that's a clear sign that they're dehydrated. But you can do that on anyone. Okay, so in this dermal layer,
So which layer?
that's the dermis. So we went epidermis and then dermis. So in the dermis, all we talked about were the lines of cleavage. We talked that it said that it was vascular because it has blood vessels. We talked about wrinkles and stretch marks and skin turgor, and that's all that's all in the dermis area.
You said the papillary layers where you get cut and bleed?
The whole thing. So it doesn't matter which layer. Both layers in the dermis have blood vessels. Accessory structures that we see in the dermis. So this is the dermis area again. So we're going to look at the hair follicle, we're going to look at sweat glands, and then we're going to look at sebaceous follicles too. So we'll start out by looking at hair. And so hair, no, don't want that. Let's see if I got a bigger picture of hair. Oh, I didn't download it. That's all I did. All right. These accessory structures, I'm just not going to go that far into depth. I think in your lab list you have the hair. When we look at the hair, anything that's above the skin, that's called the hair shaft. Anything that is below the skin, we call that the hair root. Okay. At the very end, we can see that there's a little indentation there, and then we see some blood vessels moving up into that area. That is called the hair papillae. Okay. And then the cells that are surrounding the hair papillae, those epidermal cells, because you can see, look at the epidermis. The epidermis is up here, and it goes all the way around that hair and then comes back up, right? It goes all the way around it. So then we call that the hair bulb, where those epithelial cells are surrounding that papilla. Okay. There's different types of hair on your body. You have lanuga or lanugo. Lanugo is, this is actually not on your bodies. This is what you find on a newborn. It's shed usually off of the newborn, and then when they're born, they shouldn't have it any longer, but sometimes they still do have some of it. It's fine, unpigmented hair. There's also vellus hairs. This you would have on your body. Vellus hairs are the finer hairs that you find all over your body. It's only on certain areas that you don't have this, like your lips, some of the genitalia areas, on your cornea of your eyes. So there's certain areas that you would not have the vellus hair. It's kind of like fine peach fuzz. And then terminal hairs are heavy, pigmented hair that you have on your head, in the pubic area, under the armpits. Hair color, there's variations to hair color. Some of it comes from melanin. Melanin can give the hair a dark brown, yellow brown, or red color. And then later on, when a person has white hair, when they get older, it's because there's a lack of pigment. So they no longer have any of those pigments giving a color. There's other variations too. If iron is in the hair, it's red. So there's other different variations that we're not really going to talk about. One thing that we see attached to those hair follicles, sweat glands. And there's two different types of sweat glands. We have the apocrine sweat gland, and we have the merocrine sweat gland. Do those names sound familiar? Right, because we said those were also modes of secretion on how cells secrete things. But they're also terms that we use to talk about sweat glands. Okay, so the first one that we have is called the apocrine gland. Here we have an apocrine sweat gland. The apocrine sweat glands, you can see on this model, they're a little bit deeper. On this picture, they're deeper into the dermis. And the apocrine glands we find in areas like your armpits, around the nipples, in the groin area. And they produce sort of a sticky, cloudy, odorous production. This is what produces like the body odor from sweat. Okay. The other ones that we have are called merocrine, and they're a little more superficial. Okay. So they're a little more superficial, a little closer to the surface. And those are going to be found widely distributed all over your body. And they're very numerous in the in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So when you start to feel your hands sweating, that's from these merocrine glands. The purpose for these merocrine glands is to release heat, so you don't get overheated. The fluid comes to the surface, the fluid is released through the sweat gland, the fluid gets evaporated, and your body temperature cools. They also, when they secrete, the secretions, ends up on the top of the skin, it has a real salty substance in it. The fluid is salty. Well, bacteria don't like salt. They can't live in salt, so it really helps to protect against bacterial infections. There's other types of glands. You have males and females have mammary glands. The mammary glands produce milk in a female when she's lactating. It takes hormones to do that. She has to have a hormone being produced from her pituitary gland called prolactin. Now, can a male produce milk? Yeah, if there's a problem with the pituitary gland. If he has a tumor in the pituitary gland, one of the signs will probably be that he's discharging something from his nipples, some milk, right? We also have what are called ceruminous glands. Ceruminous glands are found in your ear, and they produce earwax that's called cerumen. They're modified sweat glands. Okay. So the nervous system is going to control when these sweat glands are going to sweat. Usually when we talk about the sebaceous glands or the apocrine glands, when one goes, they all go. But the merocrine glands, where you have them in your hands and your feet, they can be more precisely controlled. So you might feel like your hands are sweating, but nothing else is sweating. Right? Then the last thing I want to talk about here is just some... See, here's your nails. Nails are another, this is your nail. I'm not going too far into that. I mean, if you were going to go into one of our other programs here, it would be covered in a different anatomy lab. So this is not going to be on the lab exam. You can see the epidermis here is deep. Well, you can see the epidermis, it's more superficial, I mean. The dermis is the pink area that's a little deeper. And then you can see the nail here. So the epidermis is producing cells that are creating this nail. And so the nail, it begins down here at the root, and then it gets pushed out here to the very end. Underneath the free edge of the nail, we have what's called the hyponychium. That's just this area right here, just underneath the free edge. And then back over here, where you have like your cuticle, we have the eponychium right there. But otherwise, I'm not going to have that on the lab exam at all. But I do want to touch on the repair of skin. So here you can see that the skin's been cut, and it's gone through the epidermal layer, and now it's gone through the dermal layer. It's even gone into the hypodermal layer, right? So it's been cut. We can see blood vessels have been cut. So the next thing that happens is a scab forms. The blood clots and a scab forms, and we have this invasion of macrophages and fibroblasts. What do macrophages do? They are the garbage trucks, right? They're the garbage cells. They're going to engulf anything. They're going to engulf bacteria. They're going to engulf debris. Anything that's been damaged, they're engulfing. What do the fibroblasts do? Fibroblasts produce fibers. That's what the name says. Fibroblast produces fibers. So they're trying to repair. So the macrophages are cleaning up. The fibroblasts are producing new fibers. And look at what's happening to the epidermis. The epidermis is growing around that scab, right? It's growing around the scab. Okay, the next thing that we see is now the epidermis has grown all the way around the scab. So now we have a complete epidermis again. And finally, all these fibers have filled in underneath that epidermis, and it's pushing the epidermis back up, and a person will still see a little indentation for a while, for quite a while, for maybe a year. They'll see an indentation before that scar starts to disappear, right? Sometimes people get what are called keloid tissue, and this is very large keloid tissue. It's magnified, but you might have seen someone that had shoulder surgery, and where that arthroscopic needle went in and it started to heal, it produces a big scar like this. We just call it a keloid. So if you end up with an elevation of skin, and sometimes it's darker, most of the time it'll be darker, sometimes it's not though, that elevation of excessive scar tissue is called a keloid. Okay, so that's it for chapter 5.